The Cold War had the US and the Soviet Union face off across the globe, with constant threats of launching nuclear missiles which could have resulted in complete annihilation of the world. This destruction never loomed closer than the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the US unsuccessfully tried to overthrow the Cuban Communist government in an incident called the Bay of Pigs, which convinced Cuba to seek aid from the Soviet Union. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev happily complied by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, since the deployment counteracted the U.S. missile threat to the USSR in Turkey and Italy. U.S. intelligence discovered evidence of ballistic missiles on October 14, 1962, when an American spy plane photographed nuclear missile sites over Cuba. Thus began the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy was briefed on the situation, and his military advisors sought to invade and strike at the missile sites of Cuba. But President Kennedy chose a more cautious approach. On October 22nd, the president stated that the U.S. Navy would form a naval blockade around Cuba and intercept all shipments from the Soviet Union to Cuba. This quarantine around Cuba prompted Khrushchev to write to Kennedy, "The violation of the use of international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression, which pushes mankind towards the abyss of world nuclear missile war." The next 6 days proved to be some of the most intense in the history of the Cold War. While the U.S. demanded that the missiles be removed, the Soviet Union and Cuba protested that the missiles were only defensive measures. Things escalated when on October 27th, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was hit by a depth charge from a U.S. Navy vessel trying to signal it to come up. The commanders on the sub were too deep to communicate with the Soviet Union, so they thought that war had begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. This decision to fire had to be made unanimously by 3 officers. The captain and political officer authorized the launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, first officer, refused. Vasily's decision is credited to have averted a nuclear war, but the crisis was far from over. For the first time in history, the U.S. military was in DEFCON 2, and the metaphorical doomsday clock was 1 minute to midnight. Still, diplomacy carried on when Attorney General Robert Kennedy privately met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. Negotiations lasted for hours, until they finally came to a consensus. The U.S. would remove its missiles from Turkey and Italy, and promised to never invade Cuba in exchange for Soviet Union withdrawal from Cuba under UN inspection. Dobrynin cabled Moscow, stated that time was of the essence, and at 9 a.m. the next day, Khrushchev responded the Soviet missiles would be removed. The crisis was finally over. Though the Cold War was still raged on, this was the closest the world had come to mutual assured destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed just how fragile human politics are compared to the terrifying power they can unleash.